So many scholars would better decorticate and describe Barbier-Mueller's literary works and achievements. Giant erudite himself, was he more interested in the newly born vernacular language that Ronsard, Du Bellay, and Pelletier-Dumont improved, or in the rarity, the bindings, and the provenance of so many so-called minor poets of the 16th century? My modest contribution to such fundamental question results in my own purchase of his 4 treasures during and after his first partial sale in the early 70s. A 1527 edition of Crétin's Débat de deux dames sur le passe-temps des oiseaux de volerie, Marguerite de Navarre's copy. Contredit de Songe Creux by Lespine de Pontalet in 1530, the works from Pontus de Thiard, as well as François Villon's 1532 edition from Galliot-Dupré. Such works, contained in the first volume of his Bibliothèque Poétique, were sold at a time at which he was offered to acquire a massive lot of Ronsard's edition in magnificent condition from a very well-known Swiss lady collector. Thereafter, he focused on ceux de la Pléiade and a great number of smaller poets, and published 6 other volumes of his Bibliothèque Poétique, giving its dignity of style to the French poetry of that century. That would tend to establish his preference for court poetry, praising l'amour courtois, and leisures of kings and their close relators, rather than poets of the 15th century and the early rhétoriqueurs. But this is most likely a too easy description of Barbier-Mueller's taste. One of the pleasures of the kings of France, from François I to Henry IV, but primarily Charles IX, was hunting and hawking. My own way of entering the 16th century French poetry was such above topics, which I collect, which I read, and which I practice. Poets such as Crétin, Salel, Passerat, Jodel, Gauchet, Bulandre, and many more, in their original condition and vellum or Morocco original bindings, were my favorite, together with technical manuals dealing with such arts. Praising and describing sports and delights were in those days a message to the nobleness. Most poets attempted to seduce, to gain consideration and esteem, and glory as a reward. The most recognized of all by the French aristocracy after Ronsard was Philippe Desportes, which works published in 1573 are almost always dressed in sophisticated and sumptuous bindings and were offered to the king and his close friends and allies. Jean-Pierre Barbier-Mueller was the jumbo collector of Ronsard, even though the poet was forgotten during 150 years until Sainte-Beuve brought him back to life. The 7 volumes of his bibliography is a major tool, a gigantic and exhaustive work covering 30 years of his life, and a major portion with the talented assistance of Nicolas du Cimetière. Again, was he more a scholar than a bibliophile? His initial requirements were certainly dictated by his taste, but when of extreme rarity, he would purchase for the sake of only completing his collection. Several lives would have been necessary to build a century of French poetry in an entirely bibliophilic condition. But when the binding is not in harmony with the language, a glorious provenance and or dedication dictates its acquisition by the collector.